Today, the United States is one of the most powerful nations in human history. Its economy influences global markets. Its military operates across continents. Its technology shapes how billions of people live, work, and communicate. Its culture reaches nearly every corner of the planet. But 500 years ago, none of this existed. There was no United States, no New York, no Washington, no Silicon Valley, no American dream. The land we now call America was home to hundreds of indigenous nations whose histories stretched back thousands of years. They built societies, governed territories, forged alliances, fought wars, and thrived long before Europeans ever crossed the Atlantic. Then everything changed. A collision between two worlds would unleash one of the most dramatic transformations in human history. Explorers arrived searching for wealth. Empires arrived seeking power. Settlers arrived searching for land. And disease arrived without warning. Within centuries, entire civilizations would be transformed. Millions would die, new nations would rise, and from the chaos, a new country would eventually emerge. A country that would go on to reshape the modern world. But to understand how America became America, we must begin long before the first colony, long before the Revolution, even before Columbus, long before European kings dreamed of colonies across the Atlantic. North America was already a world unto itself, a vast continent stretching from frozen Arctic tundra to subtropical wetlands. Across this enormous landscape lived hundreds of indigenous nations, each with their own languages, traditions, beliefs, and systems of government. Some communities followed massive buffalo herds across the Great Plains. Others cultivated crops along fertile river valleys. Along the eastern woodlands, complex political alliances connected tribes across vast distances. Trade networks carried goods hundreds, even thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lake, shells from the Atlantic coast, obsidian from the west. For generations, these societies developed independently from Europe. They were not waiting to be discovered. They already possessed histories, cultures, and identities deeply rooted in the land. By the year 1500, millions of indigenous people lived throughout North America. And for thousands of years, they were the undisputed masters of the continent. Yet, America was not entirely unknown to Europe. Nearly 5 centuries before Columbus sailed west, another group of explorers had already reached North America. The Norse, better known today as the Vikings. Around the year 1000, the stories began circulating among Greenland settlers about lands beyond the western horizon. One sailor, Virginie Herjolfsson, reportedly sighted unfamiliar coastlines after being blown, of course. His account sparked curiosity. Soon, another explorer would investigate. A man named Lee Erickson, crossing the cold and dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. Erickson reached what is now eastern Canada. There, the Norse established
A small settlement known today as Lance Armados.
for a brief moment. Europe and North America were connected, but the connection would not last. Settlement was isolated, Suppliers were limited. Relations with local indigenous people were often tense. Within a few decades, the colony was abandoned. The Vikings returned home. The North and North America faded once again into legend. For nearly 5 centuries, the continent remained beyond Europe's reach, but not beyond Europe's imagination. Then, in the 15th century, growing crisis would force Europe to look west once again, not for adventure, not for discovery, but for money. And that search for wealth would change the world forever. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, beginning a chain of events that would transform the world. In the centuries that followed, millions would die in pursuit of conquering this unknown land. Across Europe, powerful kingdoms began competing for land, wealth, and influence in the new world. So, out of the smoke of these remarkable global wars, a new nation was born, the United States of America. Over the centuries, the United States grew into one of the most influential nations in modern history. From engineering the most powerful military in modern history to achieving staggering human accomplishments, this country had earned a formidable title in the modern Roman Empire. But can this geopolitical giant continue its global dominance? To understand where this fascinating land is going, we must start from the very beginning. Long before European sails ever broke the horizon, the native people of North America had developed complex and sophisticated systems of society and government. For thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of people warred, forged alliances, and governed specific regions. By the 15th century, these communities were deeply rooted. The continent was vast, rich, and beckoned anyone who learned of its shores. The first Europeans to answer that call weren't the Spanish, but the Norse. Learning of land west of Greenland from explorers Bergny Herjolfsson, a Norse navigator named Leif Erikson, set sail across the icy Labrador Sea. Erikson had his dream made landfall in North America, establishing a small settlement in Newfoundland called Lance Meadows. But the wilderness was unforgiving. Within roughly 20 years, the outposts were completely abandoned. It would be nearly another 500 years before European fleet stepped onto these shores again. Desperate for a faster, direct route to India, the great European powers financed dozens of risky expeditions. In 1492, October 1492, Genoese explorer Christopher Columbus, backed by the Spanish crown, struck land in the West Indies. He inadvertently opened a chaotic new frontier, popularized as the New World by Florentine explorer Amigo Vespucci. It became a new arena of competition for European empires, merchants, and explorers. Vespucci, who mapped these discoveries, gained the ultimate distinction. The entire hemisphere was named after him, America. At the dawn of the 16th century, a fierce race ignited to map the entire East Coast. In 1497, John Cabot claimed Newfoundland for England. To the south, Spanish expedition under Ponce de Leon and Hernando served to map Florida and the southeast. To the north, Jacques Cartier charted the St. Lawrence River for France. Everywhere they landed, Europeans encountered Native American tribes. Some meetings led to trade and cooperation. Others ended in violence and mistrust. But the deadliest invader, the Europeans brought wasn't the musket, it was invisible. Diseases like smallpox and influenza swept through native villages, causing widespread devastation. Establishing a permanent foothold proved exceptionally difficult. In 1585, the English attempted a settlement on Roanoke Island. Three prepared and aggressive military-minded colonists burned a local native village to the ground. Famine and hostility forced them to abandon it. A second attempt in 1587 composed middle-class families landed nearby. When supply ships finally returned in 1590, when the supply ships returned, the settlement was deserted. The colonists were gone, leaving behind only few mysterious clues. The only clues left behind were the letters CRO and the word protein, carved into a wooden post. To this day, the fate of the lost colony of Roanoke remains one of the history's greatest mysteries. Undeterred, the England tried again in 1607, founding Jamestown, Virginia. Built on a marshy swamp, the settlers found no gold, only disease, starvation, and conflict with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. The colony was on the brink of total collapse until Captain John Smith imposed strict discipline, pushing the settlers to farm, trade, and work if they wanted to survive. Jamestown endured, becoming the first permanent English settlement. But in 1619, it became the site of a grim turning point. A predator ship arrived at Point Comfort, trading 20 to 30 captured African slaves for supplies. This moment marked the dark beginning of two and a half centuries of chattel slavery in what would become the United States. In 1620, another group of English settlers, the Pilgrims, landed further north in Plymouth, Massachusetts, seeking religious freedom rather than gold. They signed the Mayflower Compact before stepping ashore, establishing a foundational concept of self-governance. Facing a brutal winter, they survived thanks to an interpreter named Squanto, a Patuxent native who spoke English after being previously kidnapped to Europe. Squanto helped negotiate a non-aggression pact with the chief Masoad of Pinoyak. In the fall of 1621, they shared a three-day harvest celebration, the first Thanksgiving. As English colonies grew, other nations carved out their own empires. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company purchased Manhattan Island from the Mansi Lenape tribe for the equivalent of just $24, founding a commercial trading post named New Amsterdam. Recognizing it as a powerhouse for commerce, English warships sailed into the harbor in 1664 and demanded a surrender. The Dutch yielded without a drop of blood. New Amsterdam was promptly renamed New York City. Meanwhile, France secured the interior for trade along the St. Lawrence River and established New Orleans in 1780, the vital gateway to the Mississippi River. By the late 17th century, European empires were mapping away land agreement while completely ignoring the native populations living there. The tension snapped in 1675 with King Philip's War. Maracomet, the son of Massasoit, saw the rapid expansion of English settlers as an extensional threat, leading an alliance of Algonquin tribes. He launched a devastating scorched earth campaign across New England. With no imperial British troops to save them, local colonies, militaries launched harsh campaigns with absolute brutality against indigenous villages, targeting and destroying native villages. Maracom was killed in 1676, breaking the resistance. It was the bloodiest conflict per capita in American history. The destruction of King Philip's war set off a domino effect. Terrified of meeting the same fate, northern tribes formed the Wabanaki Confederation and allied with the France. In 1689, local grievances merged into a much larger beast. King William's War, for the first time, European power dragged their American colonies into a continental conflict, pitting settlers against settlers, tribes against tribe. This decade-long struggle ended in a stalemate. But it was only the first of four massive global conflicts that would decide who would truly rule North America. The conflict ended, but the struggle for North America was only beginning. By the late 15th century, Europe had developed an unstable appetite for the riches of Asia: spices, silk, porcelain, precious stones. These luxuries flowed westward through vast trade networks connecting Europe to India and China. But there was a problem. The journey was long, expensive, and increasingly controlled by powerful middlemen. Every shipment changed hands multiple times before reaching European markets. Each exchange meant higher prices and higher profits for someone else. Across Europe, kings, merchants, and financiers all dreamed of the same thing: a direct route to Asia. Whoever found it could become unimaginably wealthy. One man believed he had the answer: Christopher Columbus, a sailor from Genoa who was convinced that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Many experts of his time knew the earth was round. The real disagreement was about its size. Columbus dramatically underestimated the distance between Europe and Asia. Had the American continent not existed, his expedition would almost certainly have perished at sea. Yet history is often shaped by accidents. And in 1492, one of the history's greatest accidents was set in motion. After more than 2 months at sea, Columbus and his crew sighted land. Not India, not China, not Japan, but islands in the Caribbean. The people living there were the Taino. They had never heard of Spain, and Columbus had no idea he had encountered an entirely separate hemisphere. He believed until his death that he had reached the fringes of Asia. Yet, despite the mistake, the consequences of his voyage would be enormous. Europe and the Americas had been permanently connected. The world would never be seen the same again. What followed was far more significant than any single voyage. Histories call it the Columbian Exchange, an unprecedented transfer of planets, animals, technologies, cultures, and people between the eastern and western hemisphere. From the Americas came crops that would transform the global food supply: potatoes, corn, tomatoes, cocoa. These foods would eventually feed hundreds of millions of people across Europe, Africa, and Asia. From Europe came horses, cattle, sheep, and new agricultural practices. But alongside these exchanges came something far deadlier. News of these new lands spread rapidly through Europe. Almost overnight, the Atlantic Ocean transformed from a mysterious barrier into a highway of opportunity. Every major European power wanted a piece of the new world. Spain moved first. Its conquistadors pushed across vast territories in the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. Enormous quantities of gold and silver began flowing back to Europe. The wealth was staggering. Other nations watched with envy, and soon they joined the race. In 1497, English explorer John Cabot reached the coasts of Newfoundland and claimed them for England. His voyage provided England with its first foothold in North America, claim that would later prove invaluable. To the north, France dispatched Jacques Cartier. His exploration of the St. Lawrence River opened a gateway into the interior of the continent. France quickly recognized the economic potential of the fur trade. A commercial empire began to emerge. Meanwhile, Spanish explorers pushed into what is now the southern United States. John Ponce de Leon explored Florida. Hernando de Soto led a massive expedition through the southeast, becoming one of the first Europeans to encounter the Mississippi River. Wherever Europeans traveled, they entered lands already inhabited by indigenous nations. Sometimes these encounters produced trade, sometimes alliances, often they produced violence. Within only a few decades, North America had become the center of a global struggle. Empires sought wealth, merchants sought profit, missionaries sought converts, settlers sought land, and indigenous nations fought to preserve worlds that had inhabited by thousands of years. The age of exploration was over. The age of colonization had begun. And soon Europeans would discover that finding America was far easier than surviving in it. When John White finally returned, he found a haunting silence. Every colonist had disappeared. No bodies, no signs of struggle. Only a single clue remained, carved into a tree where three letters CRO. Nearby, another message appeared on a wooden post, crucial. Whether it was a distinction, whether it was a destination, a warning, or a final message, nobody knows for certain. England's first attempt to establish permanent colonies would end not in triumph, but in mystery. A mystery so enduring that histories still debate it more than 4 centuries later. The story of a vanished colony, a missing population, and one of the greatest unsolved mystery in American history, Roanoke. By the late 16th century, England had watched Spain grow rich from its American empire. Spanish trader fleets crossed the Atlantic carrying immense wealth, gold, silver, and influence. English leaders wanted a share of this new world. But unlike Spain, England had no permanent settlement in North America. That was about to change. In 1585, English nobleman Sir Walter Raleigh sponsored an ambitious effort to establish a colony on Roanoke Island, located on the coast of present day North Carolina. The mission seemed straightforward: build a settlement, secure England's claim, create a base for future expansion. But reality proved far harsher. The colonists arrived unprepared. Food quickly became scarce. Relations with nearby indigenous communities deteriorated. Fear and mistrust replaced cooperation. As tensions escalated, violence followed. Before long, the struggling settlements were abandoned. The survivors returned to England. For the moment, England's American dream appeared dead. Yet, the League refused to surrender. In 1587, returned to England for supplies. White, reluctant, believed the colonists may have relocated there. Taught England a painful lesson. Establishing a colony was far easier than keeping one alive. But England was not finished. 20 years later, it would try again. This time, the consequences would reshape the future of an entire continent. In 1607, 3 England ships arrived in Virginia, carrying just over 100 settlers. Their destination became known as Jamestown, the first permanent England settlement in North America. The settlers dreamed of wealth. Many believed gold waited just beyond the trees. Instead, they found disease, starvation, and disaster. The colony had been built on swampy ground. The water was often contaminated. Mosquitoes spread disease. Food supplies dwindled, and tensions with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy grew increasingly dangerous. Within months, death became a daily reality. The situation became so desperate that some settlers resorted to eating horses, dogs, rats, and even leather from their own shoes. Historians would later call this period the starving time. Of the hundreds who arrived, many never lived to see the next spring. Jamestown stood on the brink of extinction. In the chaos merged a controversial leader, Captain John Smith. Smith believed survival required discipline. His message was simple: he who will not work shall not eat. Under his leadership, settlers farmed, built defenses, and established trade relationships with nearby indigenous communities. For the first time, Jamestown began showing signs of stability. Not prosperity, but survival. And survival was enough. Jamestown's survival ensured that England colonization would continue. But in 1619, another event unfolded that would leave a profound mark on American history. A ship arrived carrying approximately 20 to 30 captured Africans. They were traded in Virginia in exchange for supplies. This moment marked the beginning of a system that would expand dramatically over the next 2 centuries. A system of racialized chattel slavery. Millions of Africans would eventually be forced across the Atlantic. Their labor would help build colonial economies, and their suffering would become one of the defining tragedies of American history. The consequences of that system would echo for centuries. By the early 17th century, England had finally secured a permanent foothold in North America. But it was not alone. The French were expanding into the interior. The Dutch were building commercial empires, and new groups of settlers were arriving with very different goals. Some came seeking wealth, others came seeking something far more powerful: faith. In the next chapter, religion, commerce, and empire will collide as rival nations compete to reshape the future of North America. By the early 17th century, England's presence in North America was finally becoming permanent. Jamestown had survived, new settlers continued arriving, but not everyone crossed the Atlantic in search of wealth. Some came searching for something they believed was even more valuable: the freedom to worship as they chose. 17th century England was deeply divided by religion. Many believed the Church of England had strayed from what they considered true Christianity. Among them was a group known as the Separatists. They faced persecution for refusing to conform to official religious practices. Eventually, many concluded that reform was impossible. If they wanted religious freedom, they would have to leave England entirely. And so they turned their eyes towards the New World. In 1620, approximately 100 passengers boarded the Mayflower and began the dangerous journey across the Atlantic. The voyage was brutal. Storms battered the ship. Living conditions were cramped and unsanitary. For more than 2 months, the passengers endured uncertainty, sickness, and fear. Finally, in November, land appeared on the horizon. They had reached North America, but they were not where they intended to be. Instead of arriving near Virginia, they found themselves hundreds of miles north on the shore of present day Massachusetts. Before leaving the ships, the settlers faced an important problem because they had landed outside the territory governed by their original charter. No formal authority existed. Without rules, the colony could descend into chaos. So, before setting foot on land, the settlers drafted and signed an agreement, the Mayflower Compact. It was a simple document, but a significant one. It established the principle that government should exist through the consent and cooperation of the governed. Centuries later, many historians would view it as an early step towards self government in America. The settlers named their new homes Plymouth. Their first winter was devastating. Food was scarce, shelters was incomplete. Disease spread quickly through the colony. By spring, nearly half of the settlers had died. Plymouth stood on the edge of collapse. Then help arrived from an unexpected source. A Native American named Squanto entered the colony. His story was extraordinary. Years earlier, he had been captured by English traders and taken across the Atlantic. Eventually, he returned home, only to discover that disease had devastated his community. Because of his experiences, Squanto spoke English. He became an essential bridge between two worlds, teaching the settlers how to grow crops, catch fish, and survive in an unfamiliar environment. Squanto also helped establish relations between the colonists and the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Chief Massasoit. The alliance provided stability during a fragile moment for both sides. Without it, Plymouth may have suffered the same fate as Roanoke. In the autumn of 1621, after a successful harvest, the settlers organized a celebration. Members of Wampanoag joined them. For 3 days, the two communities shared food and festivities. Over time, this gathering would become remembered as the first Thanksgiving. Though later generations often romanticized the event, it remains one of the most recognizable moments in early American history. While the English focused on settlement, agriculture, and other European power pursued a different strategy, commerce. The Dutch Republic had become one of the world's leading trading nations. Rather than building large farming colonies, Dutch merchants sought control of profitable trade routes. In 1624, the Dutch established a colony called New Netherland. Its most important settlement sat on an island at the mouth of the Hudson River. They called it New Amsterdam, located at a strategic crossroad of commerce. New Amsterdam quickly became a thriving trading center. Merchants from across Europe arrived seeking opportunity. The colony became known for its diversity. Dutch, Germans, Scandinavians, Africans, and others lived and worked together in the growing settlement. At its heart stood a small island that would one day become one of the most famous cities on earth, Manhattan. According to a famous story, Dutch representatives purchased Manhattan from the local Lenape people for goods worth approximately $24. While the exact details remain debated by historians, the story highlights a larger reality. Europeans and indigenous peoples often held very different ideas about land ownership. What one sided views as a purchase, the other may have viewed it as an agreement to share resources. These misunderstandings would become a recurring source of conflict throughout colonial history. As New Amsterdam prospered, English grew increasingly interested. The colony occupied a critical location between England's northern and southern settlements. To English leaders, Dutch control of the region was unacceptable. In 1664, English warships entered the harbor. The Dutch faced an impossible choice: fight a superior force or surrender peacefully. They chose surrender. Without a major battle, New Amsterdam changed hands. The English renamed it New York, a name it still carries today. Meanwhile, France pursued a very different vision for North America. Instead of establishing densely populated settlement, France's influence spread through trade, particularly the fur trade. French explorers traveled deep into the continent's interior, building alliances with indigenous nations, establishing trade networks that stretched across thousands of miles. The St. Lawrence River became the backbone of New France, and from there, French influence expanded into the Great Lakes and beyond. By the early 18th century, France had established New Orleans near the mouth of Mississippi River. The city became a vital gateway connecting the of Mexico to the interior of North America. Together, these settlements formed a vast French empire stretching across the heart of the continent. By the late 17th century, North America was changing rapidly. English settlements expanded year after year. French traders pushed deeper into the interior. Dutch influence had been absorbed into the English empire. And indigenous nations watched as more and more of their ancestral lands disappeared. For decades, uneasy coexistence had held. But now the pressure was becoming unbearable. Soon a conflict would erupt that many historians consider the bloodiest war in early American history. A war that would transform relations between colonists and indigenous peoples forever. The age of settlement was ending, the age of war about to begin. For nearly half a century, English settlements in New England had grown at an astonishing pace. What began as a handful of fragile colonies had become a rapidly expanding society. More settlers arrived every year. More forests were cleared. More farmland were claimed. And with every expansion, pressure mounted on the indigenous nations who had inhabited these lands for generations. The pace that once existed between Plymouth and the Wampanoag Confederacy was becoming to fracture beneath the surface. A resentment was growing, and soon the resentment would explode into one of the deadliest conflicts in American history: The alliance that had once saved Plymouth was forged by Chief Massasoit. For decades, he maintained an uneasy peace with the English settlers. But after his death, leadership passed to his son, Maracomet, known to the English as King Philip. Unlike his father, Maracomet had watched colonial expansion consume more and more indigenous land. Treaties were repeatedly violated. Native communities became increasingly dependent on colonial trade, and English courts often interfered in tribal affairs. To Maracomet, it seemed clear if nothing changed, his people would eventually lose everything: their land, their independence, their future. By the 1670s, relations had reached a breaking point. Neither side trusted the other. Rumors spread. Small disputes became major confrontations. And then in 1675, the fragile peace finally collapsed. King Philip's war began with shocking speed. Maracomet organized a coalition of indigenous nations and launched attacks across New England. Settlements had once felt secure suddenly found themselves on the front lines. Villages burned, families fled, entire communities were destroyed. For many colonists, it felt as if the frontier itself had erupted the war. The conflict quickly became a brutal struggle for survival. Neither side showed much restraint. Colonial settlements were attacked and destroyed. Native villages faced devastating retaliation. What had begun as resistance against expansion evolved into a cycle of violence that engulfed the entire region. Within months, New England descended into chaos. The colonists faced a terrifying reality. There would be no rescue from England, no professional imperial army. They would have to defend themselves. Local militaries formed throughout New England. Man left farms and businesses to fight. Entire communities mobilized for war. The conflict became one of the first truly American war, fought not for distant kings, but by the people defending their homes. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimated that a significant percentage of New England's population was killed, wounded, or displaced. Relative to population size, King Philip's War remains one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. Dozens of settlements were destroyed, entire indigenous communities were shattered, thousands lost their lives, and the social fabric of New England was permanently altered. As the war dragged into 1676, momentum shifted towards the colonists. The alliance that Maracomet had built began to weaken. Supplies dwindled, allies surrendered or switched sides. Gradually, resistance collapsed. Then came the decisive moment. Maracomet was tracked down and killed by colonial forces. His death shattered organized resistance. The war was over, but its consequences would endure for generations. For the English colonies, victory removed one of the greatest obstacles to expansion. For many indigenous nations, the defeat marked the end of their ability to challenge colonial power in New England. The balance of power had fundamentally changed, and both sides knew it. The destruction caused by King Philip's War sent shockwaves across North America. Many indigenous leaders watched events unfold with growing alarm. They had seen what happened when tribes faced English expansions alone. The lesson was terrifying. Unity was now a matter of survival. To the north, several indigenous nations strengthened their cooperation and increasingly aligned themselves with other European powers. France, together, they would form a powerful counterweight to England ambitions. Among these groups merged what became known as the Wabanaki Confederacy, and soon local conflicts would become part of something much larger. In 1688, war erupted in Europe, a struggle involving some of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. England and France found themselves on opposite sides. Like many European wars, the conflict began thousands of miles away. But this time, it would not stay there. For the first time in history, rival European empires dragged their American colonies into a much larger struggle. North America, North America had become part of the global battlefield. Known in North America as King William's War, the conflict transformed local rivalries into an international contest for empire. English colonists fought alongside their indigenous allies. French colonists fought alongside theirs. Settlements were raided, villages burned, prisoners were taken, frontiers became war zones. For ordinary people living on the edge of empire, survival once again became uncertain. What made this conflict different was its scale. No longer was no longer were these isolated colonial disputes. Now every battle in North America was connected to decisions being made in London, Paris, and beyond. The future of the continent would be shaped not only by settlers and indigenous nations, but by rival empires competing for global dominance. King William's War eventually ended in a stalemate. No empire achieved a decisive victory. No border was permanently settled. No lasting peace was established. Instead, the conflict left behind something even more dangerous: unfinished business. The struggle of North America had only just begun. Over the next 70 years, Britain and France would fight a series of increasingly devastating wars, each larger than the last, each drawing more people into the conflict, and each bringing the continent one step closer to a revolutionary future. The colonies had survived, empires had arrived, and war had become a permanent feature of life in North America. But the greatest conflict was still ahead, a conflict that would determine who ruled the continent and eventually inspire a group of British colonists to challenge the most powerful empire on earth. In part 2, Britain and France collide in a struggle historians often call the First True World War. The fate of North America hangs in the balance, and from the ashes of empire, the road to the American Revolution begins. Don't forget to subscribe our channel. Remain connected. Stay sovereign.